Welcome to the Vernuccio Novak Report and the American Political Zone. From New York, this is Frank Vernuccio.
And from Washington, this is Daria Novak.
Hey, Daria, let's start on a really high note. A success. SpaceX and their Dragon space capsule have returned Americans to space. 4 astronauts all at once went into space. I think that's the largest single number outside of the shuttle program of astronauts going up at the same time. They're going to be at the International Space Station for about 6 months. And Daria, the reason this is so important is that we don't know what the future holds for the American space program based on what NASA is doing, because Joe Biden has a substantial chance of becoming the next president. We know as part of the Obama-Biden administration, Joe was part of a group that did everything possible, excuse the blunt word, but to castrate the manned space program that NASA had. So having the private sector do this is absolutely vital.
You know, we've already seen comments coming out of people that are associated with Joe Biden that have talked about the reorientation of NASA back toward environmental programs, back toward Earth instead of toward space. So this does not portend a good future for space travel, for returning to the moon, for moving on to Mars, or literally for the various space programs that we have for launching satellites and other programs way out into space. You know, it really concerns me when we see other nation states that are potentially preparing for war in space, to see the United States basically sit down on the job, lose the lead that we had in space technology, and basically really give up control. And when I say control, I mean control of peace in space. We will not be able to guarantee, with the way things are going, that other nations are not putting up rockets and satellites or different types of equipment in space that could potentially harm the United States, harm global communication systems. The technology that's going up is out of China and different countries is really concerning to me, Frank.
Well, both Russia and China, of course, have successfully tested ASATs, anti-satellite missile systems, which means that they could make the United States deaf, dumb, and blind in the event of a war. Now, more so than any other nation, the United States is heavily dependent on space and space technology for its defense. Not to mention what our civilian economy needs. When we saw what happened during the 8 years of the Obama administration, not only to space, but to defense in general, there is real cause for worry here. And not just in the sense of, hey, this could be a problem, but this is a problem right now, a real danger right now. So I'm hopeful that companies like SpaceX and Boeing and a few others that are getting into the field can take up the slack from the possible drought of NASA flights that could occur under a Biden administration.
You know, Frank, to go back just for a moment to the idea of weapons in space, we know that over the past year, China has launched more rockets than any other country, that any other time in its own history. We know that some of these have been secured missions to the point where the Chinese won't tell us what they're sending up into space. We know that the North Koreans have a geostationary satellite over North America. We don't know what is in it. There was some speculation that it could contain some type of a nuclear device. While that's probably unlikely, we don't know what these nations are capable of doing in the future. We need to be on top of our game, and that does not mean reorienting NASA toward finding ways to resolve pollution on planet Earth. I'm not saying that it's not important that we have good environmental programs. I think everybody wants to have a healthy environment, but we also need to have a healthy space program. I am glad, like you said, that we have some private sector companies coming in, because I do think the American entrepreneurial worker, we're so creative. I really do think that we bring a lot to the table. and we can create a peaceful atmosphere in space. I love to hear that private companies are going up there.
The analogy I think is equivalent to the forming of our nation. If we had to wait for Washington to tell pioneers to go west, we'd probably still be 13 colonies or 13 states clinging to the eastern seaboard. But individual pioneers set out on their own, on horseback, on foot, and on Conestoga wagons, and they settled the entire continent. They made this a superpower nation. It's the same thing today with NASA. NASA does wonderful things, but to depend on NASA with administrations like the Biden administration, that could possibly be like the old Obama Biden administration, that took a real aim at destroying the space program, particularly the manned space program. We need the private sector to provide that long range stability that is so essential.
If Jackie Gleason were alive today, I would bet you he would be saying to the moon. We need to be back there. We've had recent discoveries of water under the surface of the moon. We found, I believe, water, even believed to be anyway, underneath the surface in Mars. There's so many discoveries to be made. The benefits that come from space travel, whether it's within the private sector or the public sector, are critical, whether it's to medicine or to agriculture, believe it or not, on Earth, with being able to diagnose diseases in forests. There's so many benefits. This is not some superfluous program that could be set aside that really doesn't matter. This is critical to our national security and literally to peace in the world.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And the corollary to all that, of course, is what will a potential Biden administration do to the United States Space Force, a space command that President Trump formed? I don't think that Biden would have the goal to completely abolish it, but it could be reduced to one guy sitting at a desk and a telephone with a plaque on the wall under a Biden administration. So I think that's really something to worry about. The short-sightedness of what we saw in the Biden Obama administration and what we're hearing from some of the people around Biden now is truly worrisome. It's an appeasement of their pressure groups. How much can we do to give money away so that people will vote for us in the next election? That's the whole focus, I think, of the Democrats and the left. It's just winning the next election, even if it means harm to the United States as a nation and long range harm to all the people of the United States.
You mentioned pressure groups. This is another concern I have. We don't really know if Biden takes over the presidency, who is taking over Biden. And I think that's another big concern. We've, talked about it on the show before, that he has connections in China and Russia, as do other family members. We know that he has connections through Kamala Harris with the very far progressive left. She was one of the most liberal senators in the US Senate while serving there. I don't know what this administration is going to look like. I don't believe that people voted for Biden. I think there's quite a bit of consensus that it was a vote against President Trump. I don't know that anyone really knows what we're in for should he assume the office.
I'm not going to be subtle. I definitely think that it's not that Biden has interest in China. I think that China basically owns Joe Biden. I can see the White House becoming essentially a satrap of Beijing in this next election. It disturbs me, and we're going to talk about this with our first guest, but it disturbs me that these real substantial issues of a conflict of interest simply were censored out by the media. Look, this should have been the biggest political scandal in American history. A presidential candidate who is basically financially beholden to America's primary enemy. And yet you saw none of that in any of the times the press talked with Joe Biden, in any of the debates with Joe Biden. This was swept under the rug. This wasn't an elephant in the room. This was a brontosaurus in the room. And the press chose to ignore it, chose to censor it, to keep it from the American people.
Not only was it swept under the rug, Joe Biden refused to answer questions on it. It was an active participation on his part in refusing to answer anything.
Right.
Now, we can't just say that he avoided the questions. He literally refused when directly asked. His people protected him from questions to the point that even the media in this country were saying, why is Joe Biden hiding out in his basement? And you know what? We've got to look at Russia and compare, I think, how the left in this country acted when there was the dossier, supposed dossier, I should say, on Trump in Russia versus when information came out with Joe Biden and Russia and Moscow's mayor and mayor's wife. The difference in how it was handled should also tell us something. Once again, we see the mainstream media is very biased in how it's handling reporting between Republican and Democratic candidates. You know, Frank, when we don't have a free press, when we have elections that are called into question about their integrity, I think we need to start worrying about the republic.
Yeah, and let's be very blunt, since we've kind of opened up this second topic. Um, we are seeing more and more revelations of wide scale, massive, impactful fraud and errors in terms of counting the votes in this election. Just within the past couple of hours, frankly, it's been found that there have been 8,000 fraudulent voter registrations submitted in just one spot in the state of California. We found that in Pennsylvania, the Attorney General seems to be attempting to roadblock any investigations into fraudulent and other acts against the integrity of the election system in Pennsylvania. We know there's been massive fraud in the state of Pennsylvania. Let's go to our first guest to continue the conversation. Jerry Bauer is the chief economist of Vidant Financial, editor of Town Hall Finance, president of Bauer Research, and author of a great new book, Makers versus the Takers. Jerry, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Frank. Great to be with you.
You know, we were talking slightly before you came on about the oddness of this past election, where a real, you can call it a political scandal or even a moral scandal, of a presidential candidate financially beholden to China. And it was basically censored out of the media. Now, you folks over at Town Hall did a great job in being the spearhead in rejecting the censorship. But what's your take on the rest of the media and what they did in this presidential election?
Well, my main interest is the censorship question. And I think that because it's structural, right? So there's an issue 1, and then there's issue 2, and there's issue 3, and there's issue 4. And we can focus a lot on those. But if you have a habitual bias in a certain direction, a structural bias in a certain direction, then that is at the root of the problem. And as we've shifted more towards social media, what we see is a serial abuse of conservatives with fact checking that's biased in one way, and also fact checking that sometimes isn't checking facts at all. I mean, there's one thing. Let's say you have a police officer who, someone going 60 miles an hour in a 55 mile per hour zone, and that police officer only pulls over black drivers who go 60 miles an hour, not white drivers who do, right? So, they broke the law, but there's bias, right? So that's a problem in and of itself. And in this case, we have fact checkers who pull you over when you're driving within the speed limit. They pull you over for simply having an opinion that doesn't fit with their own social set. So these are problems. And since I'm in investment, I think of this from a shareholder point of view. They're misusing our resources. That's ours. If you're a Twitter shareholder or a Facebook shareholder, if you're a shareholder in an AT&T, or, a mainstream media company, whatever, and that infrastructure is ours. That brand is ours. And CEOs and their top management should not be using our assets against us to kind of fill out their own political goals or hobbies. It's a misuse of shareholder resources. And we who are owners, because conservatives are the majority of shareholders, we have majorities when it comes to the votes in these companies, and we don't use them. The left shows up and is hyper organized, and we are completely out. We're completely MIA in this fight. So I'm interested in complaining about it to some degree, but I'm a lot more interested in doing something about it, in showing up at annual meetings, voting proxies, voting down board members who are not willing to acknowledge the problem, and putting new board members on the ballots of these companies.
Didn't we see something similar to that? I spoke recently to Ben Brunson, who's a veteran guy who worked in the financial sector, particularly in pharmaceuticals. And his contacts have informed him that both Pfizer and I think it was Moderna both knew well before the election, at least a week to 10 days before the election, of the successful test of their vaccines, but that information was held until after the election because they didn't want to be seen as helping Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, I'm a Pfizer owner, and I wrote to them. I'd like to know. Now you could say that I'm being political. Well, maybe, but I want to look at it from this standpoint, from a standpoint of prudence. If major political corporations engage in decisions which alienate half the country, they're tarnishing the brand, and they're creating risk to the business itself, regulatory and legal risk. So as a shareholder, I'd like them to get to the bottom of it. An allegation like that is serious enough that they ought to have an investigation, and it should not be an internal investigation. It should be an external entity that's independent that looks into it.
You know, I just want to go back in history a little bit. If we look at 100 years ago, the party system in this country was very strong. There was competition. As we move through history and we move up into a period where the parties are no longer dominant, the parties with television coming in, for instance, no longer control the agenda. It's now direct communication between the voter and the candidate. As we move from television into social media, that's even more, if you want to say, spread out. People have choices of how they receive their information, and they get it from all sorts of sources. It seems to me, perhaps, that we need to go back in some ways to a stronger party system rather than allow everything that's been happening in recent years in social media to occur, where we see these biases. The messages are distorted. We're not understanding what the principles even of a political party are. It seems that we're in a swamp, if you will.
Yeah, political parties have become disaggregated, and social media, in some sense, your circle of social media people and your leaders in that group are basically your committee man, committee woman. They play the role that used to be. I mean, I remember as a younger person, running. I actually ran for office. I was active in the Republican Party in a highly Democratic area. I got information from the chairman of the Republican Party of Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. He was in the know, and there was a committee woman. She was in the know. Now we've disaggregated all that, and we're getting information from people with whom we don't have relationships.
And how do we learn, for our audience, how do we learn who to trust today? I'm a political scientist. That was the field that I studied and taught in. And I don't even know what story to believe, what video to believe when we're out there.
I don't either. I mean, I'm really kind of grieving about this. There are no honest brokers anymore. Now, I'm a conservative, so I will tend to consume more conservative media, but I don't trust conservative media consistently. I certainly don't trust liberal media. What I'm finding is, and I've got friends who work for conservative media, is you get half a story there. And then you get another half a story, or it's less than half, and then you got to try to combine them. Where are the trusted sources? Now, those trusted sources used to be and were supposed to be network television and, say, national newspapers, but they blew their credibility. And having blown their credibility, all these other sources come up, citizen journalists come up. And sometimes citizen journalists get it right. I mean, they were right about Dan Rather and 60 Minutes and the Bush memo. That was a wonderful thing to see. But there's also a whole lot of junk that gets passed around social media memes I mean, I'm seeing a lot of like mistaken information. If it's something I happen to know something about, and then we just pass that along. So I'm not interested in an echo chamber that tells different lies than the liberal media echo chamber. We need honest institutions. For me, this is a moral issue. This is a ninth commandment imperative. Thou shalt not bear false witness. And I'm just not seeing trusted institutions that take that moral absolute seriously.
Yeah, let's stick on that point for a second. It was always the worry of the founding fathers that the Constitution that they so ingeniously scripted would work for a moral nation, but would not necessarily work for a nation that had lost its moral groundings. Aren't we arriving, if not already arrived at that point? I know your book, Makers versus Takers, or Takers versus Makers. I think it was Franklin that once said that this country would be destroyed when people realized they could vote money for themselves. And if you look at the comments made by Joe Biden, who's not even president-elect yet, despite what the sycophantic press insists on calling him, he's already offering $1 trillion to one group and $1 trillion to another group. He's going to forgive student loans and do all these things that the nation clearly can't afford. Have we, because we have lost our moral groundings, really become in a state of chaos in this country, where things like the truth don't really matter as long as the lie you're telling helps your political party?
Yes, or in media case helps. There's just like there were political bases for so many years. Now there are media bases, right? So can CNN go against its base? No, not in the long run. Can Fox News go against its base? Well, we're running that experiment now.
Yeah.
Can media outlets go against their base? Now we're all conservatives, so it's like, oh yeah, well, so, serve our base. No, that's not the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to serve the base of reality, which is truth. See, I'm a Christian. I believe that truth is actually a person who can therefore be insulted. So I'm not out to serve my base. Unless we're willing to risk that and tell the truth, no matter where it leads, no matter where the evidence leads, to go there, then we will have no voice of truth at all. Now we could do that and people still not believe us because they just want confirmation, but at least we have an obligation to put it out there and then let people hear truth and then they decide.
The one thing I wonder about these days is if we are not on the wrong course in this sense. We try to get political activists to go out to encourage people to vote, but is there something that is more corrupt within our society? You talked about morals. Maybe we need to take a step even further back, not just look at the problems in the media, but say, what is happening to the youth in this country as they grow up when our J schools, our journalism schools are not doing what they should do. The law schools aren't, the colleges aren't, and even the K-12 schools are really, in many places, a form of indoctrination. We've lost the family values in many places in this country. Maybe we need to go back almost outside of party politics and say, we've got to fix what's corrupted within our society. And many of those things, I think, do come from forces outside of our country.
Yeah, our politics is sort of downstream of our culture, and our culture is downstream of our spiritual state. So to the degree that we're a culture in decline, to that degree, we will face worse and worse political decisions. Now, so I don't want to step on anyone's toes here. I think that Donald Trump is much better than Joe Biden. So between the two, choosing between the two, that would, I'd go for Trump. But I think maybe we've lost sight of to what a degree those choices, even if there's a differential, are worse than choices we've had earlier. My first presidential vote was for Ronald Reagan. And I did that without doubt, right? So I think that because I think that he was a man of character and verbal restraint and right on policy. In the case of Trump, I think a lot of us have said right on policy, maybe not so self-controlled and with some leadership issues. So now, does that mean you go vote for Biden? No, in my opinion, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that we recognize that there's a cultural decline and that it can get worse. We can keep getting worse Democrats and worse Republicans with the Republicans just falling into cultural decay more slowly than the Democrats. And until we reverse that way up at the head of that stream, I think that's the future we're looking at.
To some extent, does that put Republicans and conservatives sort of at a loss? Because quite bluntly, and I'm going to be very partisan on this one, Joe Biden was possibly one of the worst candidates to ever run for president. He had aging mental facilities.
Yes.
He was clearly beholden financially to America's prime enemy, China. He had a 47-year career in which he accomplished absolutely nothing. Yet Democrats were loyal to him. I think on our side of the ledger, we do have more of a moral output, more moral viewpoint. We look at a Donald Trump, and frankly, a lot of Republicans and even a lot of conservatives said, this is a flawed man. I might not support him. In essence, the left's ability to put power as their
Yes.
prime directive puts conservatives and Republicans sort of at a loss.
Right. And I think that's why in traditional moral theology, there's the doctrine of prudence, right? So in a moralistic culture, and moralistic in the sense of like judgmental, not necessarily moral, things tend to be either one thing or the other. So a lot of never Trumpers would say, this is a flawed character, therefore I can't support him. But I think the prudential reasoning can lead you to, this is a flawed character, but I am going to support him. Why? Because both characters are flawed, and there are certain deeper flaws with Biden in it, like his financial ties with China, and his policy agenda, which is almost 100% wrong, right? So I think grown-ups have to make decisions like that. But what I don't think we should fall into, though, is, oh, it's all fine. Everything Trump did was fine. Everything he's ever done was fine. Everything's great. And I think we have to acknowledge there are leadership problems. Frankly, this should not have been a close election. On policy, Trump won overwhelmingly. So why do we have, at this point, a high probability of a Biden presidency? Largely an inability to project the persona of a leader and to control the tendency to speak out of turn, to not govern the tongue, to be petty. People responded to that. And maybe you say they should, maybe they shouldn't. Suburban Republican women are not good with that. And so it hurt him. It hurt us. So I think to not acknowledge that is to set ourselves up. Let's just kind of assume for a moment that it's Biden, and then we come back in 2024. If we come back with a Trump in 2024, I want a Trump who's learned some lessons. I want a Trump who's learned how to talk to the country like a president. That Trump could win, but as you say, Biden's such a terrible candidate. Then how does he win, or is it close? Frankly, because there are certain aspects of the president's personality that alienated key constituencies. Let's learn from that. I want to win. And if that means telling, hey, Mr. President, quiet down, watch what you say, be careful. We don't want a president who says what's on his mind if he doesn't take a moment to reflect about it before he says it. Grow up a little. Sorry, I know I'm ticking people off. That's how you win. So let's do that.
So we have a president right now, to me, who speaks like the millennials with his mouth. I go to college campuses and I don't see any difference, even though they complain about him. So how do we turn it around in this country so that people once again respect civility, if you will, we've got to find some way, I think, as conservatives, as the Republican Party, to basically say we can lead in an open way with dignity, with a good moral background, and basically move forward in a positive direction. I don't know what we need to do. Do you?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is raising them right. Now, that's happened for a lot of people already. Some of it, I think, is just, okay, now they're out. They went to college. They're woke. They're going to have to learn. When I was 16, I was a Marxist. That didn't last long. So, people can learn, and Biden might help us learn. A President Biden and the low growth rates might help some people wake up from being woke. I think we have to be persuasive. I think we should stop talking down to millennials. I hear a lot of people of my generation just extremely dismissive of millennials, making cracks about selfies and all the rest of it. I'm sorry, that doesn't persuade. You got to love people to change their minds, and they got to feel that love, and they have to feel respect. So, I mean, maybe a little less dumping on a whole generation and a little more actually persuading them. And by the way, who raised them? I mean, how can we slough that off? Boomers dumping on millennials. It's like, yeah, someone bought them those cell phones. Someone got them into the best college they could get into and told them they had to go. I mean, we raised them. So I'm not sure that we can quite say, what happened to you? Why are you so wrong, without bearing any responsibility? Look, I like what's in Malachi, talking about John the Baptist. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers. That starts with us not engaging in intergenerational contempt, but instead in intergenerational dialogue, respectful debate, and persuasion.
Tell us about the new book.
The book is The Maker versus the Takers. So who's the maker? God is the maker of all things, and God became incarnate in a man, Jesus. So Jesus is the maker incarnate. And what we see as we read the Gospels is that this Jesus, the incarnation of the maker of the universe, is never hostile to people who gathered wealth through productive activity. He never attacks the wealth of the maker class, entrepreneurs, builders like his foster father, Joseph, people who work in finance, like, he grew up near Sepphoris, which was the financial capital, bankers, no attacks against them whatsoever. But as Jesus, as you see him geographically going from Galilee, an entrepreneurial, lower tax, more dynamic, flatter hierarchy of society, as he goes down into Judea, which is, Washington, D.C. and environs, it's the capital region. As he goes down into Judea towards the capital, the aggressiveness of his language towards people who are wealthy increases in proportion to his proximity to the taker class, to the ruling class, which gets wealth by taking it rather than make it. And the first example we see that as soon as Jesus goes into Judea, he has a confrontation with a rich young what? You ever hear a sermon about the rich young man who's like Bill Gates and Microsoft? No, rich young ruler. That's important. He is an archon. He's, translation could be city council, senator, probably a Sanhedrin member. This is a wealthy member of the closest thing they had to a Congress. So it's near Judea, and Jesus has this confrontation. And we all know the quote, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. That's just flung in the face of people who believe in the market all the time. And they never put it in context. Jesus is in the midst of a conversation with a man of the state. In one of the gospel accounts, it even says, Jesus, while he was looking at him, Jesus said, it is easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven. To take Jesus's statement that man should give it all away, should sell it all and give it to the poor, and universalize it to all wealthy people, is to ignore what the text explicitly says, which is he's in Judea, the man's a ruler. Jesus is talking about this man. Jesus is looking at that man. And one more thing, the man says, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus lists the commandments, some of the 10 commandments. But in Mark's gospel, it's very interesting. Jesus says, don't steal, don't bear false witness. And he says, do not defraud. Now, do not defraud is not in the 10 commandments. So what's Jesus doing here? Did he forget what's in the 10 commandments? No, he added do not defraud in conversation with this man, precisely because this man was defrauding. This was of the nature of the ruling class. There's this idea of the deep state. I mean, I know that's kind of highly political and partisan right now, but it's an old idea. People who are part of a permanent ruling class, Sanhedrin members were part of a permanent ruling class. We know from the historical records that defrauding the working class was essentially part of their economic model. In fact, James, Jesus's younger brother, Protestants say that, Catholics say cousin, whichever you want to do, whether you think Mary had more children. Jesus's close relative, James, 20 years later, writes a letter from Jerusalem, and he tells the poor Christians of Jerusalem, do not rich men oppress you and defraud you. Same word in the Greek. Do not rich men defraud you and drag you before the judgment seat. So James is attesting to what you can see in Josephus or Philo, that the ruling class was essentially extractive. They didn't make wealth, they took wealth. That is not just one example. That Zacchaeus the tax collector, the money changers, Jesus's parables, his confrontations with the high priest, all of this is 100% consistent pattern. Every single one of Jesus's confrontations with wealthy people is wealthy people who use political pull, cronyism, to extract wealth. He has zero confrontations with entrepreneurs in Galilee on this topic.
Fascinating point. The book also is fascinating. I urge everyone to go out and get it. Jerry, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Look forward to our next conversation. It is a fascinating point. The misquote that you see all the time from the New Testament that the left uses is absolutely astounding, I think. But, the point that Jerry was making about how I think that the two sides don't really look at politics the same way, perhaps. I've always said it seems like our side of the coin tends to bring a water balloon to a gunfight. Let's go to our next guest. Dr. Limero is a noted author, renowned political analyst, and expert on forecast models. He has written probing insights into the issue of fraud in the 2020 presidential election. Dr. Gerard, welcome to the program.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
And the timing of having you on couldn't be better. As we went to press today, word came out that 8,000 fraudulent voter registrations were just captured in the state of California. Is this just the tip of the iceberg?
I think so, yeah. There are lots of examples across the country, and a lot more votes than 8,000 in some places.
We saw this extraordinary spectacle on both election night and the night following election night, where it seemed the president was substantially ahead. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, when no one was watching, all of a sudden, another 80,000 or 100,000 votes were found. And most of them, if not all of them, were for one candidate, Joe Biden.
Right. That also happened in a lot of states. Remember, there's a pattern here. We saw them stopping vote counting when Trump was ahead. And then we don't know what they did. They did some analysis as to how many votes they needed. Then suddenly, between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. in a number of states, a lot of votes suddenly appeared for Joe Biden. And then guess what? He starts taking the lead because apparently it would almost seem like they were just trying to get enough votes so it would be Biden ahead by 1 or 2%.
Which race was it? I think it was Lyndon Johnson's race in Texas one year, where they jokingly called him Landslide Lyndon because he just came up with enough votes to win over the other candidate, and they all came from mysterious sources. And then, of course, you go to one of the Kennedy races where old Joe Kennedy said, "I'll pay for a victory, but I won't pay for a landslide."
Yeah, that's right. He didn't want his son to buy one more vote than was necessary to win.
So can you
Right.
tell me this? When I first started voting, we used mechanical machines, and you walked into a booth and you pulled a little metal lever down for your candidates, or another lever if you wanted to vote straight party line. And when you were done, you pulled the handle back across and you watched your vote literally be counted right then and there. Do we need to go back to something like that in order to guarantee good election results?
Well, I think it doesn't have to be necessarily those machines. And by the way, that's what I grew up on too. I use those machines. But we need to have consistent, sensible voter registration and also sensible voter identification. We can't have people show up and say, "I'm Joe below zero," and then they vote in one state, but then they also turn in a ballot in another state where they used to live. Because if you go to different states, what they do now is they send out ballots to everybody in the voter rolls. In California, I think there are 3 million people on the voter rolls that don't belong on the rolls. They moved out of state, they died, something happened to them. Maybe they moved to a different city in the same state, but they still have their ballots being mailed to them. We had one gentleman report in California during this election that he received 5 ballots at his apartment house. Now he was, legally responsible for his one vote in that one apartment house location, but apparently previous people who had rented the apartment never changed their registrations, and so he got all these extra ballots. So we had to count on him to be honest and throw away ballots that weren't needed. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Some people vote anyway, and then in some states you allow vote harvesting, where party officials go around and pick up any ballots they can and either vote them or ask the people to vote and pick them up. And if they're the right kind of vote, then they take them in and report them.
I've got to tell both of you something, and I haven't even mentioned this to Frank yet, but I moved in March. So I made sure I registered to vote and I got my little voter card. I called the election office because my driver's license did not have my current address on it, even though I had updated it. And I said, I really want to vote this time. I don't want to be stopped at the polls. The voting official that I called in the county office said, "Oh, don't worry, they won't stop you." When I got to the polls, I thought this is going to be interesting because they require a photo ID. I handed them my driver's license, which was from another county, and they accepted. I said, if my address doesn't match up with where I'm voting, doesn't that matter to you? And they said, "Oh, no, we're letting everybody vote." I was
That's a
I
problem.
wanted to challenge myself as a voter because I didn't prove that I really was at this address, even though I was. I wonder how much this is going on around the country. Is my one example, that anecdotal example, typical of what we're finding across the country? Are we only seeing the tip of the iceberg? How big a problem is this?
It's huge. I'll give you an example, bigger example. In New York during the primaries, they threw out 500,000 ballots during the primaries that they found were done improperly. So for a primary, they took more care than they did for the presidential election. Isn't that something?
Yeah, it does not match also the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party, who have been consistently against picture ID for voting, but yet in their 2016 convention, you had to have picture ID to get inside.
Yeah, well, voter ID is required, and that means like a photo identification card is required in 100 countries around the world. It's required to get on an airplane. It's required for a library card. It's required to buy alcohol in some places. It's standard, and most everybody has a voter ID, and And states even will give you one if you don't have a driver's license. They have the cards where they're called ID cards. We should have voter ID, and we should only allow people to vote who's shown it, and they should show it. And I really think that we can arrange our laws in such a way that we don't permit this travesty to occur again, because we had chaos in this election. And there's so many examples of voter fraud or potential fraud that I think ultimately this is going to get decided in the courts. I think this is going to go to the Supreme Court. I think Trump will actually win because I think the evidence is on his side.
You know, there can be problems with elections and we get through them and we have the courts to resolve things. But in 2020, do you think we've reached a breaking point when it comes to election integrity? Have we lost our system going forward?
Well, if we have, it's the fault of one party, the Democratic Party, because they have pushed for doing things like not requiring signature verification. In the state of Nevada, they only required that the signature look sort of similar. You know, that's pretty weak. I mean, things like voter verification when you don't have a voter ID, that's something that's very realistic to have. Check the signature. And there are all sorts of things that they permitted. And the Democratic Party basically lobbied for and got in different places that loosened the integrity of the election, allowing voter fraud to happen much more easily. And it seems to always favor them. And if you look in California, Republicans can't hardly get elected there, although a few of them did this time. And you look at other places too. In Pennsylvania, you know, the Democratic Party went to court to loosen the restrictions that the state legislature set for the elections in Pennsylvania. And you know, Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution says that the state legislature of the respective states are responsible for setting the rules for the Electoral College for their state. And when you have the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania going to their Supreme Court, who are elected Democrats, and then overturning the law, they're basically doing something that's unconstitutional because the state legislature in Pennsylvania sets the rules, not the Supreme Court.
You know, I read an article yesterday, and in it, it said the Democrats are attempting to harvest ballots. And in many cases, this is legal in various states, and that the Republican Party, like it or not, needs to get on board and start doing the same thing in order to level the playing field. Is this a good or a bad thing to push going forward?
Harvesting, I think, is it makes it easy for voter fraud. It makes it so that a party official from either party can go to a nursing home and say, you got some extra ballots that you'd like to turn in? I'll turn them in for you. Oh, and if they didn't fill them in, I'll fill it in for you. Who do you want, Biden? No, I think it is wrong. I think it makes it very easy to have fraud. I don't think somebody should walk into a voter center and turn in 1,000 ballots or 10,000 ballots. I don't trust them. How do we know they didn't just get a whole bunch of blank ballots and sign them and fill them in themselves? They don't check the signature in many states, so they get forged signatures, and you wouldn't even have them checked.
You know, there are two issues we're dealing with. One, of course, is the commission of fraud under one guise or the other in the election. But the other issue is the acceptance of fraud. You know, we were now seeing cases from numerous states around the nation that there was some level of fraud, some level of malicious action or negligence in terms of ballot security. But that separate second issue is that when they are exposed, the reaction of the media and particularly the Democrat elected officials is, yeah, so what? Aren't we looking at a time when we're almost seeing the acceptance of intentional fraud by the Democrats and by the media?
Let me give you a philosophical answer. I have studied socialism in depth. I have an incredible library on it. I wrote a book on it this year because I knew it was going to be a big issue. The book is called Real World Socialism, if somebody wants to read it. And let me tell you, when you look at socialism around the world, one of the things you see that anywhere where it's tried or is attempted, basically the morality goes down. The laws are made for them and for the government to get power. It's not made for the people and to protect their freedom or their self-interest or their interest at all. And so what you see, I think, around the country is the morality surrounding our election. And that has gone downhill because I think the Democratic Party has adopted socialism for its ideology. And I think their entire platform for Biden-Harris is a sociologic or socialist ideology. And I think you have to expect this. Anywhere, I always said, I wrote this 6 years ago in one of my books, socialism always leads to moral and economic bankruptcy. We are seeing economic bankruptcy in our election. We really are. And I think it's come because one party wants to push that particular ideology, and they don't care what laws you break. They don't care, for example, like sanctuary cities. Those laws don't have to be obeyed by them. They don't have to do things like maintain law and order in their cities. Anarchy is fine. BLM and Antifa can riot. They can burn down buildings. They can hurt police officers. It's a philosophy we're dealing with.
Aren't we seeing, though, something that's a real gut challenge, where what's good for the left, regardless of whether it obeys the law or not, is going to be accepted? We saw that in the part of the media. We saw in the presidential and vice presidential debates. We saw in the media coverage of this campaign. It didn't matter what level of honesty was there as long as it helped Joe Biden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you notice the story on Hunter Biden and influence peddling that his family apparently did while he was vice president, and they all made a lot of money from it. That story was squelched. And by the way, the big tech folks, Google and Facebook and Twitter, they go along with it too. They basically are on board with the Democratic Party. Any stories that are bad, I know many people who are conservatives who have been basically banned from Twitter and Facebook. They're shut down because they don't agree with everything that the Democratic Party agrees with. That's terrible. It's un-American too.
So how do we protect our right to social media? How do we protect our right to express our opinion in the newspapers if we can't get into social media, we can't get into print?
Well, there's a couple things. First off, we try to fight election fraud to get our people into office. You notice we've picked up a whole bunch of new conservative Congress people. It's not being made public much. I mean, people aren't mentioning it. But right now, the Democrats only have 219 of the 218 they need in the House. And there's still outstanding elections that haven't been determined for the House. We need to fight to make sure that Georgia is a free election and that they don't use any software that has backdoors. That's one thing. We've got to have elections so we can elect people that represent us. The second thing about the social media, we can start using other people. There's an organization called Parler, which is something similar to Facebook. There's something called MeWe, another social media organization that apparently believe in free speech. Twitter and Facebook don't. We know that. They keep censoring people that disagree with them. So I think we need to use new media. And also for the existing people, once we have the House and the Senate and the White House, we are able to pass laws to basically remove the monopoly that Google and Facebook and Twitter have. And they haven't been allowed to be sued. But really they could be because they are acting like publishers. They're not acting like a free platform.
Shouldn't, in fact, they be treated as a common carrier? You know, you can't be turned away from American Airlines or Amtrak because of your political beliefs.
That's
But
right.
if we buy that idea and invest it in terms of Facebook or Twitter, saying you, because of your size and because of your position, are essentially a common carrier, and therefore you don't have the right to discriminate based on your own partisan political beliefs.
I think that's wonderful. You know, another analogy I give is suppose you're a person who moves to a new city and you need a new cell phone. Let's just say you're not going to take your cell phone with you or whatever. You need a new cell phone account. If you call Verizon and they say, "Oh, are you a conservative?" and you say, "Yeah, I'm a conservative," and then they say, "Well, sorry, we don't give cell phone service to conservatives." That's essentially what Google and Facebook and Twitter are doing right now. They're saying if you're conservative, we don't give you service. So I agree with you. Verizon is like a common carrier.
Where do we start, though? I mean, now we saw even in the past couple of days, we found out that that Moderna and Pfizer actually withheld the information about their vaccine because they thought it would probably wind up helping Donald Trump if they announced it before the election.
Well, you know, that those are private companies that are not common carrier. It's a little different situation. They did withhold information. It's similar to the media withholding information on Hunter Biden and the influence peddling scam that they were part of, apparently. And so I don't know. You may not be able to clear up every unfair thing, but in general, if you get most of the, you get most of the people accessing social media, that would be a good thing. And if you get people certainly do have a choice of going to different mainstream media, and they do. They used to go to Drudge, but since Drudge has changed its political outlook, now they don't go to Drudge anymore.
Right.
But they have Epic Times and other places.
Dr. Gerard Lamiero, thank you so much for being on the program. We look forward to our next conversation.
That sounds great. I look forward to talking to you again, too.
And to our audience, thanks for tuning in.
We welcome our newest radio affiliate, Net Talk America in Washington, D.C. at 96.7 FM. We're broadcast throughout the United States on radio and television and worldwide on the web. Watch us on Roku, public broadcast stations, and on the AM/FM 247.com network. You can access our program anytime on our website at usagovpolicy.com. We're sponsored by the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, a division of the American Analysis of News and Media, Inc., at usagovpolicy.com and the Institute for American Politics. Email us at truthinradio@gmail.com.
Our producer is the amazing Abigail White, and our director is the brilliant Jeff Hansen.